It was just another night on the city streets, cold, quiet, and empty. A homeless man sat on the sidewalk, his worn-out jacket barely enough to keep him warm. He wasn't bothering anyone, just minding his own business. But that didn't seem to matter when a patrol car pulled up. Officer Daniels, a cop known for pushing his authority, stepped out, his eyes locked on the man like he was a problem that needed fixing. "You can't sit here," he barked, his voice laced with impatience. The homeless man barely reacted, just looking up with tired eyes. That only made Daniels angrier. Without warning, he kicked the man's few belongings aside. "I said, move." The man flinched but didn't budge. Daniels, feeling emboldened, took it further, shoving him, trying to make a show of his power. But what happened next was something the officer never saw coming. The homeless man, who had seemed weak and defenseless just moments before, moved with lightning speed. In one swift motion, he was back on his feet, steady and controlled, staring directly into the officer's eyes. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Daniels took a step back, suddenly unsure. There was something about the way the man carried himself, like he wasn't just some random guy on the streets. And then, with one simple move, the homeless man reached into his pocket and pulled out an FBI badge. For a moment, everything froze. The streetlights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows on the pavement. Officer Daniels' eyes darted between the badge and the man holding it, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Just seconds ago, he thought he was dealing with just another homeless guy, someone he could push around without consequences. But now that same man stood tall, his expression unreadable, his grip firm on the badge that gleamed under the dim light. Daniels swallowed hard. "This some kind of joke," he muttered, his voice quieter now, less sure of itself. The man didn't answer right away. He just studied the officer, like he was deciding something. Finally, he slid the badge back into his pocket and took a slow step forward. Daniels instinctively stepped back. "You're making a lot of bad choices tonight," the man said, his voice steady but laced with something cold. "And I suggest you start thinking real carefully about your next one." Daniels felt his pulse quicken. He was used to being in control, used to people backing down the moment he showed force. But this man, he wasn't afraid, and that was dangerous. The radio on Daniels' shoulder crackled to life, a dispatcher's voice breaking the silence. But he didn't reach for it. He couldn't. Because right now, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what to do, and that feeling terrified him. The air between them grew heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Daniel's hands hovered near his belt, but he didn't move. He couldn't decide if he should reach for his radio, his cuffs, or just walk away. But something told him that walking away wasn't an option anymore. The man took another step forward, his eyes locked on the officer like he was studying him, reading every thought racing through his mind. "You don't even know who you just put your hands on," he said, his tone still calm but carrying weight. Daniels squared his shoulders, trying to reclaim some sense of authority. "Then why don't you tell me?" he shot back, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering his next words carefully. "You don't ask the right questions," he said, "and that's your problem." Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't like being talked down to, especially not by someone he thought was beneath him. "You're on the street, sitting in filth, and I'm the one with the badge and gun. Seems like I'm the one asking questions here." The man let out a slow breath, almost like he was disappointed. "You think that badge makes you untouchable?" He shook his head. "Let me tell you something. There's power, and then there's real power. You don't know the difference." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice cut through the night. "Agent Carter." Both men turned. A black SUV had pulled up, its tinted window rolling down just enough for the driver to be seen. The officer's stomach dropped. That wasn't just some passerby. That was someone with real authority. The so-called homeless man, Agent Carter, didn't look surprised. He simply turned back to Daniels, watching as the officer's face slowly registered the weight of his mistake. Now, Daniels wasn't just dealing with a man on the streets. He was tangled in something much bigger, and it was too late to undo what had already been done. Daniels' throat went dry. His grip on his belt tightened as he glanced between Agent Carter and the black SUV. His mind screamed at him to regain control, to say something, do something. But for the first time in his career, words failed him. The SUV door opened, and a man in a sharp suit stepped out, his presence demanding attention without a single word. His gaze settled on Carter first, then flicked to Daniels, cold and assessing. "We've been looking for you," he said, but it wasn't clear who he was speaking to. Carter didn't flinch, he simply nodded. "Took you long enough." Daniels felt his stomach twist. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing: this was way above his pay grade. He took a step back, his fingers twitching near his radio, but the suited man's eyes locked onto him, stopping him in place. "Officer Daniels," the man said smoothly. "Do you have any idea who you just put your hands on?" Daniels swallowed hard. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to act like he had control. But every instinct told him that whatever Carter was involved in, it wasn't something a street cop like him should be messing with. Carter took a slow step closer, his eyes never leaving Daniels. "You made a mistake tonight," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "The question is, how much are you willing to lose because of it?" The wind picked up, rattling the street signs. The weight of the moment pressed down on Daniels, suffocating, inescapable. He had spent years bending the rules, pushing people around, believing he was untouchable. But now, standing in front of Carter and the suited man, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Fear. And for the first time, he realized he might not walk away from this night the same man he was before. Daniel's heartbeat pounded in his ears. The cold night air suddenly felt suffocating. He had spent years patrolling these streets, thinking he had everything figured out. But now, standing between an undercover federal agent and a man who clearly held more power than even his own department, he realized he had no idea what he had just stepped into. The suited man studied Daniels for a moment, then smirked. "You look nervous, officer." Daniels clenched his jaw. "I just want to know what's going on." Carter let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Now you want answers." His voice carried a weight that made Daniels feel small. "You didn't care about answers when you walked up to me, did you? You just saw what you wanted to see." Daniels bristled. "Look, I didn't know." "Exactly," Carter interrupted. "You didn't know, and that's the problem." The suited man glanced at Carter, then reached into his coat pocket. Daniels instinctively tensed, ready for the worst. But instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a small black envelope. He held it out toward Carter. "We need to move," he said. "Now." Carter took the envelope, flipping it open just enough to scan the contents inside. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Daniels caught a glimpse of what was inside. A photograph, grainy, but clear enough to make out faces. His stomach dropped. Because one of those faces was his own. His breath caught. What? Carter closed the envelope and slid it into his pocket. "I told you, Daniels," he said, his voice lower now, unreadable. "You don't ask the right questions." Daniels felt the ground beneath him shift, like the entire night had flipped upside down. His mind raced. Why was his face in that file? What did they know? What did they want? And more importantly, how long had they been watching him? Daniel's chest tightened as his eyes stayed locked on the envelope, his own face, inside a file held by a man he didn't even know. He wasn't just part of this situation anymore. He was the situation. Carter watched him carefully, measuring his reaction. "You starting to understand now?" Daniels swallowed hard. "What the hell is this?" His voice came out rough, more desperate than he intended. The suited man took a step forward. "It's a file on you, officer," he said casually, as if they were discussing the weather. "Your record, your history, The things your department conveniently looks the other way on. He paused. And the things they don't. Daniel's blood ran cold. He had cut corners before, roughed up suspects who deserved it, taken money from the wrong people when no one was looking. But he had always convinced himself he was too small to matter, that nobody was really paying attention. Carter shook his head. You thought you were the hunter, he said. Turns out you've been the prey this whole time. Daniels felt the walls closing in. His mouth went dry. What do you want from me? Carter took out the file and flipped it open, his finger tapping a page. There's a bigger case at play here. Corruption, cover-ups, dirty cops. He met Daniel's eyes. And you're part of it. Daniels took a shaky breath. So what now? Carter exchanged a glance with the suited man, then held up 2 fingers. You've got 2 choices, he said. Option 1, you play tough, act like none of this is real, and in a few days, you'll be nothing more than another officer who made a tragic mistake. He let the words hang in the air. Or option 2, you start talking, you help us take down the people pulling the strings, and maybe, just maybe, you get out of this in one piece. Daniel's head spun. He wanted to deny everything, say he wasn't involved, that they had the wrong guy. But deep down he knew better. They had him, and there was only one way out. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. What do you need me to do? Carter gave a small, knowing nod. Good choice. But just as Daniels thought he had a grip on the situation, the suited man's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. He turned to Carter. We've got a problem. Carter stiffened. What kind of problem? The man hesitated before looking back at Daniels. Someone else is already ahead of us. Daniels frowned. What does that mean? The man handed Carter the phone. Carter's eyes flicked over the screen, his jaw tightening. It means, he said, slipping the phone back into his pocket, you're not the only cop on that list. Daniel's stomach dropped. He had thought he was the target, but now he wasn't so sure. Because if he was just one name on a list, who else was on it? And how many of them were already too far gone to save? Daniels stood there, his mind racing. He had spent his career thinking he was untouchable, but now he realized he was just another piece in a much bigger game. And worse, he had no idea who else was playing. Carter slid the phone back into his pocket and turned toward the SUV. We need to move now. This is bigger than just you. Daniels hesitated, his gut twisting. He had spent years ignoring his conscience, convincing himself that bending the rules was just part of the job. But now, faced with the truth, he saw the road ahead clearly. If he walked away from this, he'd always be looking over his shoulder, waiting for the day his name came up again. Taking a deep breath, he followed Carter toward the SUV. Tell me what I need to do. Carter glanced at him, studying him for a moment before nodding. First, we find out who's pulling the strings. As they climbed into the vehicle, Daniels looked out the window, watching the city blur past. He had spent years thinking he was in control, but in reality, he had been playing someone else's game all along. Maybe he couldn't undo the past, but he had a choice now. He could keep running, or he could help bring it all down. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a one giving orders. But for once, maybe that wasn't such a bad thing.